I believe that humans are made of four things: flesh, blood, bones, and stories. And it is the stories that make us human. They connect us and make relationship possible. Jesus knew that. Good religious leaders like Laura and Tony and John know that. And good journalists know that too. Marie Wilson is a good journalist. She has used her skills and education to tell and to draw out stories for most of her life in South Africa, Southern Canada, and her home in the North. I first met Marie in the 1980s at Yellowknife United Church. Peter Short was our minister. I was on the board. Marie was singing in the choir. You can make long-term friends in churches, as you know. I knew her also as the face of Northern Canada's first ever daily television news program. Marie was CBC's regional director for Northern Canada then, and it was she who made that first happen in multiple Northern languages. This was when people in Southern Canada still got their shirts in a knot about having French on their cereal boxes. Northern news was a wonderful accomplishment, but only one of many accomplishments that have touched the lives and changed the stories of many people. Marie's book, North of Nowhere, is a remarkable and unique memoir by an accomplished Canadian, a passionate woman of faith, wife, mother, and grandmother. While it is straightforward in the writing, when you read it, you will want to pause periodically to think about how you connect with a particular story, place, or experience. North of Nowhere, Song of a Truth and Reconciliation Commissioner, is indeed also a song. At times, I heard it as keening in the ancient Celtic tradition. Other times, as a hymn of hope and courage. Sometimes the song was one powerful, harmonious note, voiced by a choir of children who are silent no more. Welcome to Hillhurst United, Marie.
Good morning to all of you. I don't know about you, but I'm having a great day. I had a wonderful encounter. I was here for the earlier service. I don't know if some of you were here for the earlier service as well, but if you were, I hope I'm not going to be too repetitive. But in between the services, I had a hasty but really cherished encounter with an old friend of mine, also from the North, Greg Sterling. Some of you may know of him. But my connection to him was through his mother, Jan Sterling. And when I left Southern Ontario and various parts of Canada decades ago to make my more permanent home in Yellowknife, I think I was in Yellowknife United Church for about 5 minutes before I had been corralled into serving on one of the committees. And it was the Outreach Committee, which I think really is today's equivalent of your Right Relations Committee. It's the outward service, social justice arm of what we do as church. And it was a great honor to serve on that committee for many years with Jan Sterling. Some of you may know her or may know her by reputation, but she had a huge reputation in the North for all of her good work outwardly. Well, the reason I say that is because one of the things that happens to us when we come to church, through encounters such as that, or through the simple act of sitting in an old oak wooden pew, is that we are reminded of many things in our lifetime. Church is, among other things, continuity for so many of us. It's an anchor in our lives in that way. It holds the memory of sacred moments of baptisms and marriages and memorial services and funerals and times of breaking open the most sacred inner parts of ourselves And I was sitting there today between services, looking at the little oak receptacles for communion cups. I don't know how many oak trees gave their lives for our churches across the country, but we had the exact same kind of setup. And I remember those. I remember them because they were child size. It seemed so particular, and I remember the wooden plates for our offering back in those days, which were very narrow and flat, almost plate-like, like dinner plate-like, but also made of oak in our church and lined. And that was our little collection offering plate. And I talk about that in this book. I talk about a scene of that because so much of my foundation and my sense of who I was and who my family was and who our country was and my place in it started in gathering spaces such as this, with teaching such as some of the ones we've shared again today as the timeless teachings that bind us together as faith community. And yet it's also a reminder of how comfortable we can be in all of that and so oblivious to what all else is going on around us, as I certainly was as a child, but also as I was for much of my early adulthood, not knowing, first of all, that our church was part of this big national policy called residential schools, that we ran schools, that people that we hired and put in charge harmed children, sometimes for decades at a time, and that we are now invited as part of the Canadian society responsible for acknowledging our history and going forward, to ask ourselves deeply, now that we know, now that we do know, because I know I was not alone in not knowing. I didn't learn it in those church pews and I didn't learn it in school. But now we do know. And what do we do with all of that? And how do we take steps to make sure we are going forward in a new and better and more respectful way, both respecting of others, but with self-respect, living up to our own stated values and our sacred teachings. I put my name forward in the big application process to become a TRC commissioner after the big court case. And if any of you don't remember that history, it's important to know that we had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada because we were forced to by 80,000 survivors of residential schools who were still alive at the time and who took us to court. Not us all alone, but us as the United Church of Canada, along with the Anglican Church of Canada, the Presbyterian Church in Canada, and over 50 entities of the Roman Catholic Church. And we were, did I forget anyone there? Did I say the Presbyterians? They were also part of that. And we were held to account in the courts for what had happened to children over the many decades, because residential schools they predated Confederation, in fact. There were residential schools in Canada before we even had official policy around it. And they ran for over 150 years, and over 150,000 children went through them, and who knows how many countless hundreds of thousands of intergenerational survivors are now the ripples in the legacy pond, which we see all around us, not necessarily in this room, but on our streets and in our communities, with direct lines or indirect lines to that history. So I put my name forward when it became clear whether there was going to be a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, because I felt I had things to offer, whether they would be the right mix or the right fit, or whether they would be accepted or not, I didn't know. But I felt called to offer what I had to offer, as we all are every day in our everyday living. We are called to offer what we have to offer. And I offered, yes, my journalism skills, and thank you, Carolyn, for those beautiful words. Yeah, thank you for that, and so much more. I had to offer that I knew the country well. I had lived in many parts of it. I had to offer that I was a non-Indigenous person, and I felt that was an important part of a story that was supposed to implicate all of Canada and not just Indigenous people. And I had been raised in one of the churches that ran the schools. Whether that was a comfortable fit or not, it was me. And I thought, someone's going to have to show up and be the face of the perceived perpetrator. Someone has to do that. And in the end, I was never made to feel anything but welcome. But I was prepared for that, just so you know. I also knew, and I felt this would be very important, I knew that the people in the congregation and in the church that I had grown up in was full of good people, with good hearts, with good intentions, and with long histories of doing amazing things in service to others. That we were not just one thing. That the church was not just one thing. It was not and should not be reduced to just those people in the church who harmed children. Nor should it be limited to those people in the church who thought it was a good idea to sign up to be part of the great assimilation project of our country. But we are both individual and we are collective. And so I knew I also had that balanced perspective to bring. So long story short, lucky for me, I was chosen to be one of the 3 commissioners. And so I also bring along today my fellow commissioners who are in this book. Murray Sinclair, now the late Murray Sinclair, who was our chair. Chief Wilton Littlechild, who is of your own province, Musqueam, who is also often in this book. And we were a team that walked the journey together. And I bring the voices of thousands of survivors who are reflected in this book. And I bring the names of hundreds of people from every region of the country who showed up, who stood up, who participated, who fundraised, who baked cupcakes, who did all manner of things to participate and to be also courageous enough to show our faces in the face of huge and horrible accusations, not accusations, affirmations of what had happened and the harms it had created. So one of the things, because we are here, all of us, in this faith gathering, that I thought would be helpful to just maybe probe a little bit is to reveal for you, to share with you a little piece of the book that talks about that part of the story of residential school legacy that was named repeatedly as spiritual abuse. The spiritual abuse of being told that the ways you had been raised with in your communities were pagan and heathen and wrong, and that your parents and all others were going to hell, were going to burn in hell. And so were you if you didn't do this, that, and the other. But also the spiritual abuse of those who have huge attachment to their Christian faith in whatever denomination, and who have seen that as an important part of their joy in life and also their healing journeys. And those who live, as we witnessed earlier this morning, and I'm sure you all know well, Reverend Tony, who travels in both of those paths and understands how they fit together. They do not contradict each other in that way. So I thought in leading into the conversation that I'm looking forward to with John, I would just read you an excerpt on that topic of spiritual abuse. The book, for those of you who are not familiar with it, travels the journey of the TRC, following the themes of our national events. We had hundreds of community events, but we had 7 national events, and we named them according to the 7 sacred teachings that are in many Indigenous cultures and traditions. And so this particular excerpt is from the section that is on the theme of love. Obviously not limited to Indigenous teachings. Those are the teachings at the core of most world faith traditions. And we've already sung about it and talked about it this morning. So let me just share this excerpt. This is a chapter called The Big Red School, which was all about Shubenacadie. From adult children who survived the school, we also heard about a different kind of fight. There was a lot of fighting, organized fighting, kids on kids, and sometimes children forced to fight their teachers and supervisors in that particular school. But this is a different kind of fight, the fight over faith itself. I don't want to go to church. I don't want to listen to priests. I hate them. I don't want to listen to them anymore. No more nuns, no more priests, no more punishments. I will never forgive the church for what they did to me. They should apologize to us. At school, I had to learn to pray in English and in Latin. Today, I am still relearning prayers in Mi'kmaq. I am also a strong Christian. I've got nothing against religion itself. I don't blame the church. I blame the people who were at residential school, the priests and the nuns. It hurts me when people put down Christianity. I am a strong, proud Christian. My church has been important to my healing. Now I also get stronger when I talk, thanks to this eagle feather. What they did to us was so bad, they even turned God into a victim. I couldn't forget those words, spoken so quietly, sorrowfully, almost prayerfully by one of the Atlantic survivors. Increasingly, the church wasn't easy for me either. I was a Protestant, but that was no defense. Other regions of the country were already making clear that atrocities had happened at Protestant-run schools too. Our TRC work was rattling my faith. What in God's name were we thinking? Everything I was hearing was so contrary to my own spiritual beliefs and the Christian teachings that fed me as I grew up. God is love at the heart of it. Now, day after day, I was witnessing accounts of atrocities perpetrated by the supposed servants of God. Amid so many graphic examples of lovelessness, selfishness, racism, blatant immorality, and blind criminality, all committed by those on the payroll of the church. This was the only conclusion that approached making any sense to me. Even God was a victim. I carried anguish and shame as a member of the faith that inflicted so much harm on generations of children. Unsupervised, unaccountable, frontline workers got away with repeated deviant behaviors that have continued to tarnish the reputation of the largest religious institution in the world, built and billed as the standard bearer of goodness and kindness. Even God was a victim. So may we have the courage to change the things that we can.
Thank you, Marie. We'll just take a few minutes to be in conversation. When that phrase, God was a victim, leapt off the page. When I read it, and I didn't know that.
I believe these things deserve our tears, you know. Yeah.
And I read, and I read that, and I know that with my theological mind, and I could write an essay on what that means. But when you heard that from someone, and it impacted you, did it change what you believed and how you believed and why you do what you do?
Well, I actually probe that question quite a lot towards the end of the book, where I talk about, there's a section called New-Eyed Seeing. And And it's why I sit there in the pew today and I see everything in a different way. It takes me a different place. It's not just nostalgia, it's a provocation. How might I see things differently? So it was a provocation to me, but it also was not the end of the story. Even it wasn't the end of the book. And I was very intentional not to sort of sugarcoat the story or to try to turn it into some kind of Hollywood ending, because what our TRC mandate said is that the one piece of our mandate which was not on a timeline, you have a 5-year TRC which happened to take us 6.5 years, but you have a timeline. The one glaring paragraph that stood out from there that said was reconciliation. It said reconciliation is an ongoing, individual and collective process involving survivors and their families, involving the churches and their descendants, involving the governments and their people, and the people of Canada. It's the one place in the mandate where we're specifically named as the people of Canada. And so it's ongoing. That's my point, is that yes, you get a gut punch in the moment. You do for sure, and you get a spirit punch in the moment. But you also know that this is not the end of the story. It wasn't the end of the TRC journey either. Love happened to come up in the Maritimes. We had 7 of these events, so we had already been at that point to Winnipeg and the Manitoba region. We'd been to Inuvik and all across the north. This was all over the Maritimes. We were in Halifax for this national event around the theme of love. And then we went on to follow the themes of truth in Saskatchewan, of humility in the case of Quebec, of honesty in the case of BC, and wisdom in the case of Edmonton and Alberta, where we ended up. And what I did in the writing of the book is to curate what survivors said, because at every single hearing, there were things like that were just so devastating. But there were also things that were so extraordinarily uplifting, so uplifting. And I remember one of the places where we were, where there was someone from one of the church communities who came forward and wanted to speak. And what they said was, I have witnessed more forgiveness in this forum here today by survivors modeling that to others who have harmed them than I have ever seen in all my years in clergy in an organized church. Now, I'm not saying that's an absolute truth, but it was definitely an observation that rang true for that person in that moment. So we saw extraordinary movement on all fronts, and it was always uplifting. And I've tried to leave each chapter of the book with a lift, each section with a lift, and the overall book, I hope, with a pathway forward of encouragement and hopefulness.
Oh, it is that. I mean, certainly the book and the chapters are hopeful and humorous and invitational. That's for sure. There's your beautiful poetry and stories are there. You made me think of, James Finley is a person who suffered abuse as a Catholic person, and he said, God protects us from nothing, but is present in everything. And those words stick for me as a reminder that, people create God into some strange image, but all we really can count on is God's presence with us, even in our own sorrow and struggle. And I think that is so important to know. You must have had something, someone, some prayer, some person help you along the way. I think we all try to have people. Who did you turn to? You mentioned a bit at the first service about your own lifeline, but how did you receive the support you needed to do this incredible work?
Well, and I shared in the last service, and I'll just repeat because it's a familiar name, but we, each of us as commissioners, had a spiritual advisor. And mine was the very Reverend Dr. Peter Short, who had been my minister years ago. And Carolyn made reference to the time frame when he was my minister in Yellowknife, and we stayed friends as family for all the years going forward. And though we were not close at hand, we were, a phone call away, and he was present for all the national events. So that was really, really important. Not so much to debrief in the moment when it was a tough hearing. There, I tended to turn more so to the health supports who were on site. We're in many time zones, and you're not always in the right time zone to be calling Fredericton, But we had health supports with us every day, and people that we could debrief with, and we were always challenged to think about what was our personal care plan for that evening. What were we going to do? I also did call home because I couldn't talk about what I had heard with my family. Many of you last year met my husband, Stephen, who was here, and he's a residential school survivor, so I definitely was not going to download with him long distance what I had heard, because that would have been damaging to him and triggering probably for him. But I did have, as they say, a love line to him and to my grandchildren and my children, that I knew that I wasn't alone, unlike these children in the schools who felt so abandoned and so alone. And unlike these children, they were children. I was an adult. I was an adult with life experience and scars of my own, some scar tissue of my own that strengthened me. And I had access to communication. I could reach out and I could be heard. And that was not the reality for so many. I did also get very practiced, and by that I mean disciplined, about my own daily spiritual practices, daily prayers in a variety of ways, and meditation. I really needed that to just get quiet with myself and prepare myself for the day. What I did not do is 1 second of social media. We started our commission as Facebook was just on liftoff, and our chair was immediately enamored with it and got involved a lot. And I was not that, because I could see right away what was happening with comments and how it could be torpedoed and things could be so ugly and negative. And I thought, my job is to keep my spirit strong and clear and open. And if I start shutting down because I'm too injured by what I'm hearing back, I won't be able to do my work. So, we also took care of each other, I'll just finally say, as commissioners. We supported each other and became very familiar with each other's stories. So we knew when something had been said or heard that would potentially have been a trigger to one or the other of us. And that was really helpful.
You talk about that in the book. There's beautiful stories that you talk about having been at a long meeting and then a long quiet drive together, and then something funny happening, and how you could share, the darkest of moments and the most joyful of moments. And you talk about one was a jock, one was a judge, and one was a journalist. And you tell that story about what each one of them bring. 2 quick questions. When you look at the 94 calls to action, there have been some moments. There's been the visitation as an example of the Pope and other signs. How do you look at the 94 calls, and not a report card, but what gives you hope when you see some of those actions come to life?
Well, I have to honestly say that most of my hopefulness actually comes with the action of people in community doing extraordinary things. We have seen movement on the part of some institutions, educational institutions, who have made awareness of all this history, or in some universities, the need to have taken a course focusing on Indigenous issues of some sort as a condition of graduation. And it might be Indigenous literature, or it might be Indigenous law, or it might be a especially curated course on truth and reconciliation or the residential schools. But to make that part of being equipped to go out as a professional in the world, which is so different from those of us who could graduate without ever knowing anything about any of these things. So I think that's really hopeful. I know children in schools, not consistently across the country, and not in a mandatory way yet across the country everywhere, but in some places mandatory, children in school are learning about this part of our history. And I think that's an area where you ask about where do I see hope in all of that in the implementation, is where I see parents groups and educational boards insisting on that. Where I'm discouraged is where higher levels of government can say, we're not going to do that anymore, we're going to cut all that funding or no more of that, and there's no response. My encouragement is when people say, that is not good enough, we can't go backwards, we need to keep going forward. And I do see also, I mean, my book is one tool. There has been such an explosion in Indigenous literature, and some of them residential school accounts such as Stevens is, but it's much, much more than that. It's a chance for us to become acquainted with heroes in our midst that we've never really met before. You know, we've lived in such ignorance of each other as neighbors, and so I think that's a really encouraging thing. But I've repeated this many times, John, I'm not one with a checkbox and say 94, oh, we're only at 3, or we're only at 7, or we're only at... What I want to know is work being done? Because some of those calls to action will never be completed. And indeed, I don't want them to be completed. I want them to be normalized as our new way of being. That we are constantly updating and getting more intelligent about curriculum and what we are feeding our children. And what we are considered qualifications. That you can qualify as a doctor or a social worker or a lawyer or a teacher in this country. But let me just say those first 3 were so often people who are in harm's way show up at emergency wards, in courts, before or in correctional facilities, and the people who are trained to lead them, to design them, to set policy for them, to run them, have had no education whatsoever in any of this history. So, you know, that needs to be a continuum. It needs to keep changing, and we need to insist on it. We also have, unlike when we released our 94 calls to action, a complete turnover in who's running our national political parties. So we are the continuity as society to have to say to those new leaders, this is what you promised when each and every one of you made apologies. This is what you said we were going to do going forward, and this is what we expect of you if you expect a vote from us.
Thank you, and it kind of leads into my last question. You know, we're living in a time right now, when you flip the news or read the paper, where we're living in really turbulent times, and there's bullies. And I'm sure in this process, there were things that you learned that might help us. When we leave today, I heard you just say we are called to call leaders to account. Is there anything else that you can offer us as your wisdom or hope for us as we move forward?
Well, and that we also hold ourselves to account. You know, if I stand back from the whole story of what we heard from survivors from coast to coast to coast, the broad storyline is horrible things happened to us as children. Among the things it did is it blew our families and our communities apart. As a result of what happened, I am not proud of how I have been able to parent or have not been able to parent or have been present or have not been able to be present for my children. And my great hope is that things can be better for all our grandchildren. You know, that's really the big story that we are not only invited to be part of, we are ethically, morally, and legally responsible to be part of writing the sequel to that story. It came out of a court case, remember that. We were obliged to have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The people of Canada were named in that mandate. And what is our intention for going forward? What is our intention as parents, as grandparents, as members of faith community, as members or supporters of the culture and the arts, as members of athletic organizations, whether for adults or for children, and as citizens as citizens who have a responsibility. We are the government. We are the government of the people who we are mandating to represent us. So where are our big voices when they are needed? And how do we use them? Not in an angry and polarizing way, but in a loving and caring and moral way that is about the kind of society we want to be and believe ourselves to be. And I think on the, I don't know whether you're alluding to this, but I wanted to circle right back to the very first thing, which was that citation that you asked me to read from the book, the particular ones you zeroed in on, and the gut punch. I think in the current situation where we are being bullied by a big neighbor, and that a big part of that bullying is being supported by communities that claim to be communities of faith, are we at risk of God once again becoming the victim and allowing the name of God to be used as a political weapon? And are we willing once again to be in our pews on all the strength of all that oak and not pay attention to what's going on around us? I think we need to make a loud noise, not just a joyful noise, though that would be good, but a determined voice, a respectful and respectable voice that says, this is who we are and this is how we wish to be seen, and standing together. That's what I hope. And by the way, my middle name is Pollyanna, but I don't give up,
Well, I'm glad that's your middle name. And I do what I do because I refuse to let bad religion have the day. I call this community, in person and online, to be about good religion and to speak out and up with confidence that we don't do it alone, and with the courage that that is our calling in this time. I want to say...
Can I just say, in my view, the trap is that good religion doesn't come from the institution. It comes from spirit. And we bring spirit to inform and infuse the institutions where we gather and the spaces where we gather. And so I think that crosses all the lines and all the divisions that we have superimposed on ourselves.
Totally agree. I agree. I want to thank you for your book, your story, your presence this weekend and with us this morning.